Hi everyone, welcome back. This is the video for the second reflection paper. I released the first one last week, and if you remember from my introductory video and other reintroduction information, this is part of the new reflection slash synthesis project. That's one of the three main projects for the class. We have the observation project, the book chapter project, which incidentally the rough draft is due on April 2nd. And then finally, we have the new reflection synthesis project, which consists of a series of reflection papers, which this is the second one I'm giving you instructions for, then a final synthesis paper that we'll talk about later. All of this information is, again, on the new revised syllabus, so you can see that here. So anyway, moving on into the second reflection paper. So this one is going to be due on April 13th, and like the previous one, you have two options. So whereas last week you could have either identified an example of assimilation and accommodation and disequilibrium, or reflected on our current historical conditions. It's a similar case for this week. You can either reflect, identify an example of Werner's orthogenetic principle, which is explained in the video on Werner's theory. It's also explained in the assigned reading by Werner, called the Crane textbook chapter on Werner, the original syllabus. You can still find it in the readings folder. And then there's also the Werner PowerPoint file, which describes the orthogenetic principle at the beginning. So any of those three are a good source of information on the orthogenetic principle. I'll be posting the video on Werner's theory shortly. Hopefully that will be useful. So that's one option. One of the options for the second reflection paper. So the second option is, when you think about, since your previous reflection, we're going to consider what new changes you've seen. Not changes in the world necessarily, but changes in your understanding of things, changes in your emotional responses to things. So I've given you two prompt questions here to consider. First, have any new patterns of behavior emerged? Or, as I said in last week's instructions, do you feel like you're progressing through any stages of development? Stage being some systematically constant way of thinking or feeling. I know for myself, just to give an example, sometime one of the days last week, everything going on just made me feel incredibly anxious and just sad, nervous about the prospect of our whole way of life just changing. And that really bothered me for like a day and a half. I'm sure that's bothering many of us. And while it still bothers me, for whatever reason, that went away. After a day and a half or so, I no longer felt that way. I wouldn't say I'm not concerned, very concerned. There's awful things happening. But I went through this period of emotional change. So consider for yourself, are there any sorts of changes like that? Specifically, what I want you to focus on, what I've described here in the second prompt, is I want you to look for ways that you've developed or that you are developing. And to identify those, you want to think about whether there's a change in you that is not a direct result of some external change. So it's one thing, we're constantly changing due to external circumstances. But see if you can find a case where some aspect of your circumstances is constant, and yet the way you think or feel about it has changed, which would indicate a developmental change. So the example I gave before of my anxiety over the prospect of our whole way of life changing, where I was anxious about that for a day and a half and then became, for whatever reason, much less anxious about it. The situation hasn't changed. There's still the prospect of a dramatic change in our way of life. It's maybe even more real now than it was then. But my understanding of it, my profound feelings of anxiety about it subsided, at least for now. So I look forward to seeing your first reflections, and I'll give you feedback and talk about those and what I saw in the next video. So my hope is that will become a big part of this online class. That the videos are not just me lecturing, but are me giving feedback based on what I've seen in your work. So I'm looking forward to that because our in-class discussions were, I think, so important to the class previously. So I'm hoping that we can still have a new version of that. All right. So now moving on to the first option here. If you, instead of reflecting on our current conditions, instead you might, or you could do both actually, but the first option is to try to identify an example of a developmental change that reflects Werner's orthogenetic principle. So I want to explain this now. Here we have Heinz Werner, who's a developmental psychologist, who incidentally, Werner was my doctoral advisor's doctoral advisor. He died in 1964 when my doctoral advisor, Joseph Glick, was studying with him. Werner has a very interesting view of development. All right, so that's all for this video. As I said, if you're choosing the Heinz Werner option, see the video on Werner's theory that I'm posting shortly. And again, as always, let me know if you have any questions or comments.